But I want to go back to the beginning of this trek and just tell you for a moment how it started off. I've been looking at money from the beginning, and when I looked at district budgets, I thought, what's missing in here are the actual salaries of the teachers at schools. And so on a whim, I picked up the phone and called about 12 different districts around the country, including Baltimore and Atlanta and Cincinnati and Seattle, where I live, and Los Angeles and a bunch more, and said, hey, you know, I'm kind of wondering, do the salaries match across all these schools? Or are you finding that you have very senior teachers at some schools and junior teachers in another one? And without fail, every single person that answered the phone said in slightly different regional accents, we don't have that problem here. Our teachers, we actually have people who want to teach in inner city schools. We have people who want to teach in poor schools, and our distribution is really good. And while being confident that they believed what they were answering, I went ahead and dug up the data and did Freedom of Information requests, and certainly found that in all of those 12 districts and in every other district I've come across, with the exception of a very small few, that they were wrong. That we do have a maldistribution of teacher salaries across schools. And so I want to share 6 major findings that I have had with you in that trek over the last 12 years. So the first is that teachers in schools with more poor and minority students are paid less than teachers in schools with predominantly white and wealthier students in the same districts, off the same salary schedule. So this has nothing to do with property taxes or access to resources or how much revenues were obtained. This is about money that came to the school district and then was deployed and paid out to teachers across schools. And we're paying these teachers over here to teach these white kids a lot more money than we are to teach these poor minority kids off the same salary schedule. So here's how it works. You know, teachers come into poor schools, and that might be the only spot they get an opening, and they work there for a year or two, and they transfer across the district to a school with a more stable teacher population, and then they stay there for the rest of their career. And so this revolving door process, what it does is it brings one set of teachers in through the opening in poor and minority schools. They transfer over to another school and end up staying. Some of them leave the district or leave teaching along the way. The poor and minority schools have a harder time recruiting teachers, and that's one of the things we'll find out more. But I want to show you the financial impact of this, and so I brought some slides, and this is our first slide, will come up now, which is how this gets buried into district budgets. On the panel on the left, what you see are 2 schools, Wedgwood and Martin Luther King. These are in my school district in Seattle. And this is some old data, so Martin Luther King doesn't even exist there anymore. But Wedgwood is a school with just, in a neighborhood with great views of Lake Washington. I don't know if you're from Seattle. But anyway, the district reports that it spends $3,700 per pupil in Wedgwood. And if you drive south to higher poverty and higher minority areas across the Ship Canal, you'd find Martin Luther King, where the district reported it spend more, about $3,900. But in reality, those budgets are built off something we call an average district salary. We'll just assume that every teacher makes $50,000, and we'll plug in that $50,000 number. And it's off now, but on the right panel, you'll see that it actually reverses when you put the real salaries of those teachers, where it turns out that we're spending a lot less in Martin Luther King, the school where the kids are much higher needs, than in Wedgwood. So this happens all the time, and it's hidden. We can't find it. You've really got to do some forensic accounting to find it. While salaries are not the most important thing, they are indicative of other differences that do matter. First of all, schools with lower salaries have fewer applicants per opening. We find that sometimes they'll have a handful, maybe 2 or 3, and across the district you'll find another school in the same district where they'll have 30 or 40 or 100 or 300 applicants per opening. So the salary differences are indicative of the labor market differences. In the next slide that I've brought, we also know that certain schools, those with high minority and high poverty populations, have very high turnover. And high turnover is something that affects kids. So when the teachers are leaving all the time, the kids have a different experience, the families have a different experience, and the teachers there have fewer mentors. So when this one study where they looked at schools where 70% of the teachers stayed after 5 years, you can look at the demographics of that school. It's very low minority. and low poverty, and the opposite is true where you find schools where 30% or fewer of the teachers have retained. So moving on, then another variable that differs is the increased turnover that these schools are having with seniority-based layoffs, which is something that hit hard this last year, in especially schools in California, but in other states as well. Where are all the junior teachers that got laid off? They're in these high minority, high poverty schools. So those schools, again, had more turnover. So the fourth point I want to talk about is another slide that we've brought, which shows that it's not just across schools, but also within schools. And this is really new findings that I've found looking at the Schools and Staffing Survey, which is if you look at the average salary of teachers teaching remedial classes, it's about $6,000 less than the average teacher salary teaching AP or honors classes. And we know who's taking each of those classes. Again, you're separating, the students are being separated out across classes, and we're paying people more to teach the ones who are further along academically. The absolute opposite of what we say we're about to do, that we're all about. So obviously there are several district policies that are contributing to this. There are salary schedules and seniority rights and seniority preferences and district allocation practices. But the last slide I wanted to bring to you shows you something that comes back to the federal level, which is that the Title I policy intended to demand equity in spending doesn't work. If you see on the left, this is in one district, the lower poverty schools have a certain amount of money that they get from state and local resources. And the higher poverty schools on the right get Title I also. But the Title I works to fill in that hole that's created by the inequitable allocation of the state and local resources created by these patterns. And that's what I have to show you. Thanks very much.